Welcome, viewers and listeners, to another edition of CHP Talks. We're here with a repeat guest, Mr. Tom Harris from the International Climate Science Coalition Canada, and he speaks to us from Ottawa today. Tom, thank you for joining us again today.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Rod.
And I'm going to remind folks, not all of our listeners may have heard your introduction for you that we've done on other shows, so I'm going to give it again. Tom Harris is the Executive Director of ICSC Canada, the International Climate Science Coalition Canada, a federally incorporated not-for-profit coalition of scientists, economists, and energy and policy experts working to promote a better understanding of climate science and to foster a rational, evidence-based discussion about sensible and realistic responses to climate change. Mr. Harris has 40 years' experience as a mechanical engineer, project manager, science and technology communications professional, a technical trainer, and a science and technology advisor to a former opposition senior environment critic in Canada's Parliament. For the past 22 years, he has been working with a team of scientists and engineers to promote a sensible approach to a range of energy and environmental topics, particularly focusing on climate change. So again, thank you so much for being with us today, and look forward to what you have to bring to us at the beginning of 2024.
Yeah, it's good. It's good to be on.
You alerted me in the last couple of weeks to a paper that you have just produced at the International Climate Science Coalition Canada organization, and it has to do with Ottawa policy. The city of Ottawa has had what they call a master plan regarding climate change, and of course, you had a very good report in the early days of that, and now you've produced the second part of that report. It's 50-some pages long, I think, and I've gone through quite a bit of it, but you are debunking some of the, I guess, what hobby horses and the pet peeves of the left, of the environmentally focused left, misguided in many ways. But let's just start off. I think near the end, you deal with this question of, and then we'll go back to the beginning of wherever you want to start, that the science is settled. You hear that from a lot of people, and we heard it about COVID. We've heard it about many things, but you have some. You mentioned the global warming petition project that had 31,487 signers. Some 9,000 of them are PhDs, and they say there is no convincing evidence that climate change is happening in a way that it can be directly attributed to man's use of carbon or production of carbon dioxide. And so maybe that's a place to start. It certainly is a belief that is held by many in the country that our government acts as if it is universally accepted as truth, that carbon dioxide is causing climate change. So I think you're set about to debunk that myth. So I'll let you weigh in on it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Rod, it turns out nothing in science is truth. Okay, science is merely people's opinion based on the information that they have. If you go back in philosophy to the time of Plato, he defined what truth is. Truth is universal. In other words, it applies everywhere. It applies here, it applies on Mars, it applies on Alpha Centauri. It's necessary. It has to be the case. 1 + 1 = 2. That's necessary. The queen moves in a certain way on the chessboard, and it's certain. Okay, there's no probability involved. It's in the bank. It's 100% true. Now, the interesting thing is that science is never universal, necessary, and certain. And it's sort of funny, you can remember those three quite easily because UNC, universal, necessary, certain, that would be United Nations climate. just coincidental. but it can never apply to science, because science changes when we have new information. I mean, in the early days of the climate scare, I actually thought that there was a climate crisis and that we were causing it. And then one day, a scientist invited me into his lab, a geologist, and he showed me that throughout the history of the Earth, which is real history, it's proxy data. I mean, it's things that they've determined as a result of studying isotopes, for example. But what they found was that carbon dioxide at times in the past was up to 10 times higher than today, 4,000 parts per million, even higher than that. And temperature was not high. Temperature, in fact, was the lowest, the coldest it had been in the last 500 million years, which is as far back as we can go with, our measurements of these proxies. And at that time, 440 million years ago, when CO2 was 10 times today's level, we had the coldest period in the last 500 million years. So, I mean, he started to open my eyes to what was real. And yeah, sure, the computer models can forecast it all they want, but the fact is, there was no correlation in Earth's history. Sometimes it was hot when CO2 was high, sometimes it was cold, a lot of the times it was in the middle. And right now, we're at one of the lowest levels of both CO2 and temperature in the history of the Earth. Okay, people get excited about a 50% rise since 1880 in CO2, but that's nothing. I mean, 50% rise is nothing because, first of all, it's a trace gas. Okay, it's 420 parts per million. And secondly, it's been 10 times higher at times in the past. And you were asking about a consensus of world scientists. Well, I should just direct you to this. I'll just reach over here and grab it. This is the latest report of the non-governmental International Panel on Climate Change, the NIPCC. Okay, this one happens to deal with energy sources, in particular fossil fuels, but there's a big section in here about whether or not there really is a climate crisis. And I actually helped edit parts of this, but you'll notice at the end of the chapter, like, look at this. The whole thing is full of references from scientists all over the world saying that there's no climate crisis. But of course, the CBC doesn't want you to know that, and most media don't want you to know it. So they don't say anything about the NIPCC. They only tell you what's politically correct. So yeah, there's no consensus. And it's interesting, even if there was a consensus, it really wouldn't prove anything. And you might notice on the bookshelf behind me, I have the Bible, of course, but Einstein right there. Einstein actually, when he came out with his theory of relativity, was interesting because in those days, it was the left that supported him and the right who opposed him. And they actually had 100 scientists who oppose Einstein open letter that was written. And they asked him, they said, well, what do you think? 100 scientists oppose you. And he said, well, if I was wrong, one would be enough.
Yeah.
So science is never proven by consensus anyway. But as I said at the beginning, yeah, there's no consensus. Look at this. This is 1,000 pages roughly, and this is only one of several reports. And people can check it out on the web if they like. It's climatechangereconsidered.org, climatechangereconsidered.org. And what it shows is that the science is all over the map. I mean, it's a very immature science. We really don't know what's going on. It appears very unlikely that we're causing dangerous climate change. And you know that to some extent because since 1880, temperatures went up, or I should say CO2 went up about 50%. But the temperature only rose 1.2 degrees Celsius, 1.2 degrees in 143 years. So, I mean, that's such a small change that you wouldn't even notice it in your entire lifetime. So they have to rely on computer models to get a climate crisis for the future. But the models don't work. So, I mean, if we go back 30 years and we plug in the conditions that existed at that time, temperatures and CO2 levels, et cetera, and we let the models run to the present, we don't get today's conditions. In fact, the models overpredict it by about 200%. So, I mean, excuse me. I don't know about you, but if I had a stockbroker who was 200% off, whenever you forecast anything, I would change stockbrokers.
Sure. Well, there's a couple of elements at play in this discussion. One is whether we have a climate crisis, and the other is whether human activity, I suppose you could break this down into two questions, whether human activity is contributing to it and whether human activity in the production of CO2 is contributing to it. So there, some people, like I guess everybody has a camera nowadays. I'm amazed when I see the amount of data that is, little video clips and things of various events, happening around the world. They could be small town events, what somebody did in their backyard, to raging floods and things like that. But on page 15 of your report, you have a statement: there's no real life data showing more frequent things like floods, droughts, hurricanes. And that would be interesting because, of course, you hear it every day if you're watching CBC or on, some of the nature channels. The statement that obviously we're having more extreme weather now than we've ever had. And it may be true that we're recording more extreme weather now than we ever have recorded, because 100 years ago we didn't have everybody with a cell phone and so on. But do you want to comment on that, about the frequency of extreme weather events?
Yeah, for sure. And you're quite right. They call that observational bias. Okay. I mean, it's interesting. If you had 100 hurricanes in Oklahoma 100 years ago, the fact is most of them would never have been seen. But today they would have all been, of course, you wouldn't have a hurricane in Oklahoma, you'd have a tornado. But regardless, right. if you had all those events 100 years ago, very few people would have seen them for two reasons. One is because there weren't very many people there. And two is that people didn't have cell phones to actually share it with everybody else. Now we have, it's interesting because across the world, there's been a 13-fold increase in infrastructure. So statistically speaking, if there was one hotel on a mile-long chunk of beach in Florida, there's now 13. Okay, now it's not always the case in every individual place, but 13-fold increase in infrastructure. What that means is that when a storm hits, there's more things to be damaged. So of course, you're going to see the insurance claims will go through the roof, but it doesn't indicate that the actual events that are occurring are actually happening more frequently. It's interesting because most of the records, if you look at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that's a government body in the US, they track records on a statewide basis. And it's probably the best covered chunk of the world. Now, it's only a small part of the world, but if there was this massive increase in extreme weather, you'd expect it to be reflected in the NOAA database, because they actually record for statewide levels. Cities is not really important because cities are such a small area, and they're also affected by the urban heat island. As you replace, forests with a parking lot, you're going to have temperature will rise, of course. But if you look at it on a statewide basis, that's a pretty good sample. And they keep track of things like the maximum temperature, minimum temperature, most snow, highest rainfall, biggest hailstone. It's funny because that was the one record that was set so far in 2023 was the biggest hailstone. It was over 5 inches in diameter, if you can believe that. It was set in Colorado. But so they look at all these different things, and they actually plot by state when all the records were set. And in the whole of 2023, the last time I looked is about 3 or 4 days ago. It was maybe it was a week or so ago, but there was one record set in the whole of 2023. One record. That was the biggest hailstone, as I say, in the history of Colorado. Now, if you go back to 1936, you find that there were 27 extreme weather records set. In fact, temperature was one of them, but other things as well. And those records still stand today. And they were set in 1936.
Wow.
So what you find is that there's nothing going on in the extreme weather record, which is the best of its kind in the world, all across the US. So you have to say, well, what about the rest of the world? Well, if you look at the records for the strongest hurricane, the worst floods, all those sorts of things, they're in our report. People can actually check it out. It's ICSC-Canada.com, and it's right on the homepage, ICSC-Canada.com. And it's our second report. And if you don't mind, Rod, I'd like to explain why we put out two reports and why they're separated by almost 2 years.
Sure, please do. Yeah.
Yeah, well, sure. In Ottawa, they want to spend up to $57.4 billion for a city of a million, if you could imagine that, to try to help stop climate change. They call it the Climate Change Master Plan. And Ottawa is going to lead the world, of course, in stopping climate change, which is pretty ludicrous considering Canada is 1.5% of world emissions of greenhouse gases, if you don't count water vapor. And Ottawa is less than 1% of Canada. So we actually asked a climatologist in the United States who actually thought there is a climate problem. And we asked him, okay, using the EPA, that's Environmental Protection Agency's best computer models, what would happen if Ottawa went to zero emissions and stayed that way all the way to the end of the century, to the year 2100? So he ran the numbers really carefully, and he found out the change in temperature for the Earth, and this is if you think we're driving climate change, was 1/10,000th of 1 degree. So it was interesting because during the mayor election, we hadn't yet put out report number 2, which deals with the science. We had people going to the microphone and saying, okay, so you want to spend almost $60 billion of our money, which would be $60,000 per person in the city, and you want to spend it to reduce temperature by 1/10,000th of 1 degree, which you couldn't even measure, of course. And of course, the politician said, no, Ottawa is going to lead the world, lead the world. Yeah, well, I don't think China even knows where Ottawa is. But regardless, we put out the first report back in January of 2022, and it didn't talk about the science, but what it did talk about is the detrimental impacts, which include things like cost and power blackouts and stuff like that, the infeasibility, the fact that you simply cannot do it. Okay, with a society that's heavily dependent on electricity, for example, if you switch to wind and solar, you're in big trouble when there's no wind and it's at night and you need power because you're not going to get any. And we can only store for a very short period of time in batteries. So we put out that first report, and also the policy implications, the fact that it makes no sense when China puts out twice as much emissions as the US, and China essentially has no limits, and we can talk about that later. So we put out that first report because we wanted people to feel the pain, so to speak, that was coming. We wanted people to realize that this was a suicide pact for the city of Ottawa if they actually did, 702 industrial wind turbines taller than the Peace Tower, 36 square kilometers of solar panels. If they tried to do all this crazy stuff, it would have no impact. But regardless, it would be really, really hard on people in Ottawa, especially the poor. And so we wanted people to understand that, so that by the end of a couple of years, when it had gotten around enough and enough people had read it, they'd be saying, do we really have to do this? Oh, it's so painful. And then our second report comes out and says, no, there's no climate crisis, so the whole thing's pointless. And so that was why we delayed releasing the second part, because if we released the science right at the beginning, of course, you'd have Suzuki and others jumping up and down and say, oh, you're a bunch of climate deniers, and they wouldn't even listen to our discussion of the negative impacts. So that was our strategy, and we'll see if it works. I mean, over the last 2 years, people have brought up what was in our report, and I could tell they read it because they're using the same wording in public meetings and things like that. And so we'll see. I mean, it just came out, last month, and we hope people can share it because it's on our homepage, both report number 1, which, by the way, it applies to really any industrial city across the world, okay, when you look at the impact of trying to stop climate change with wind and solar power. And people can see report number 1 and report number 2 are both on our homepage at icsc-canada.com.
Yeah. Well, and it's very interesting. I mean, you are kind of a real leader in this research and the distribution of this information. I think I regard you as one of the foremost people in Canada who is getting this message out in such a coherent, logical, and well-documented manner. And you're focused really right now, this focus is on Ottawa, but it has such great implications. I mean, tremendous implications for the rest of us across the country. Canada and Ottawa being the center of the move with our prime minister to make Canada, carbon neutral. I guess it's unbelievable the lengths that they are willing to go to on something that is certainly unproven. And in our opinion, your opinion and mine, it's a completely false narrative, and yet willing to destroy the national economy and hurt people in many direct ways. But they want to make everyone driving electric cars, but they have no way of creating the electricity for the cars.
Yeah.
And there's no conceivable, realistic way of doing that. And that's why I guess they start talking about 15-minute cities and you'll own nothing to be happy, because I don't know about the be happy part, but owning nothing, we can see that coming if they're allowed to continue to squander our resources and limit our ability to look after ourselves with energy.
That's right. And one thing that I find disappointing is that there's so many consequences of the climate scare that people are fighting against. And we can go through a few of them if you don't mind, but they don't bring up the cause of the whole thing, namely the fact that the science is wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, take, for example, the carbon tax. Okay. It's really a tax on carbon dioxide. It's not really carbon at all. I was watching a new video that came out from the federal government, 23rd of December, I think it was dated, and they're using our tax money for super propaganda. They had right across the screen, carbon pollution. Well, it's not carbon. Carbon is a solid substance, okay? And occasionally it's airborne, like in the case of soot, because that's amorphous carbon. But so you have carbon, which is graphite, diamonds is carbon. Those are solid substances. These are not carbon emissions. That would be like throwing your pencil in the air. I mean, but they're not pollution either. So they call them carbon pollution. They're doubly wrong. I mean, carbon dioxide. In fact, it's interesting because there's another report like this one called Biological Impacts. Okay, people can see it again at the climatechangereconsidered.org website, and they look at the biological impacts of the increase of CO2. And it's positive. It's extremely positive. We've had hundreds of billions of dollars more crop yield because of CO2. We have forests that are increasing, across the world. There's more green matter across the world now than there's been in NASA's satellite record. I mean, they show it point blank. They can see it from orbit. So, the bottom line, though, is that people have to look at, okay, the consequences of the climate scare. First of all, the carbon tax, okay, applied across the board, except farmers don't have to pay it. But it has to get paid when the truckers bring the produce to the supermarket. Okay, so there's a carbon tax there, and then there's a carbon tax when you buy things or when you buy your own gasoline. So the carbon tax is a consequence of the climate scare. People are fighting the carbon tax, but they never bring up the science. I mean,
Yeah.
Danielle Smith, for example, she's been the premier of Alberta. She's been arguing constantly about provincial jurisdiction versus federal jurisdiction. Well, all that's going to happen. I mean, it's interesting. The Epoch Times had a very good article by John Robson, and he said, they're rallying around the flag, so to speak, because they had this victory, but it's a white flag. Okay. They've surrendered the fundamental premise that there's a problem. And so what's going to happen is the federal government are simply going to tweak the law and tweak the regulations until it is constitutional. And then they'll ram it back down our throats again. So, the people that are opposing the carbon tax, they are not talking about the fact that it's not required because there's no climate crisis.
Yeah.
Similarly, the people who oppose wind turbines, south of Ottawa, we have a number of communities that are having wind turbines forced into their communities because of the climate scare, because, they say it will reduce CO2 emissions. Whether it will or not is a good question when you look at how they're made. That's a totally different topic. But, Rod, there's some really serious problems to do with these wind turbines. And, last night, for example, I was listening to an interview with Mariana Alves Pereira, who's a specialist in what they call vibroacoustic disease. And apparently wind turbines emit And remember, this is a consequence of the climate scare. They emit low frequency sound below 20 hertz or below 20 cycles per second, which is called infrasound. And it can be quite loud, actually. Infrasound travels for miles, okay? In the Earth's crust, of course, low frequency sound travels a very long way because they use it to detect nuclear explosions to see if people are obeying the nuclear laws of, the testing laws. But infrasound is interesting because you can't hear it, but boy, oh boy, you sure feel it. And in fact, it's so bad that in Germany, some people have actually built a bedroom bunker. Okay, they actually dug into the ground several stories down, several tens of feet down, and built their bedroom down there because it is so bad for people. It's interesting. This is not a particularly new thing. Back in 1940s, they started it with respect to the aeronautical industry when people were working right beside large machines. But, infrasound is the hidden threat of wind turbines. And what the companies do is they measure dBA, which is decibels A, which is the typical measurement. But that only records what the human ear hears. That doesn't measure anything down around 10 hertz, for example. And, it's interesting because Mariana Alves Pereira, I was interviewing her a little while ago, and she said because it doesn't measure the infrasound, the companies think that they can tell people, oh, look, there's only like 5 decibels down in the infrasound range. She said, no, because it doesn't really measure low frequency sound, you have to add 70 decibels to whatever the dBA measurement is in the infrasound to see what's really there. And the symptoms are terrible. I mean, all kinds of nausea and headaches and indigestion and all sorts of other issues, and eventually psychiatric problems. Now, that's a consequence of the climate scare. Okay, because they're trying to reduce greenhouse gases. But you don't see them going to the microphone in public meetings when they're opposing a wind farm and say, and it's not necessary. And that's where I'm disappointed with Pierre Poilievre. And, why the Christian Heritage Party and the People's Party are actually the top 2 parties with respect to the climate issue. Because what Pierre Poilievre says is, okay, we're going to have no carbon tax. But we're going to have regulations. We're going to have a push for electric vehicles. We're going to stuff carbon dioxide underground in what they call sequestration. We're going to get off coal, no more coal because of CO2. Well, no, Pierre, if there's no climate crisis, stop it. There's no reason to have these alternative plans.
That sequestration, I was going to say that, and I think way back, even Stephen Harper talked about sequestration as opposed to some of the other proposed methods. And I agree with you 100%. Why spend any money, time, energy, and emotion on something that isn't necessary? And they have not demonstrated that carbon dioxide is causing a problem.
Yeah, exactly. I went to some of Pierre's rallies, when he had them here in Ottawa, and it's interesting to see what's going on. And he gets up and says, there'll be no carbon tax. And everybody cheers. Yay, Pierre, no carbon tax. We're going to solve this problem with technology. And there's more cheers. And I think, what? There's no problem. And it's interesting because I've spoken to insiders who actually know Pierre, and the indication I get is that he knows there's no climate crisis, and he knows that Canada could do nothing to stop it, even if there was, but he wants to be prime minister, and he figures he has to say these things. Well, the answer is no, you don't have to say it. And the approach I would use if I was Pierre Poilievre or if I was Danielle Smith is I would say, look, this is a super complex field. Some people say it's the most complex science we've ever tackled. So it would be irresponsible to not listen to scientists across the board. We want to hear what real scientists from Carleton University or University of Toronto or Calgary or whatever, we want to hear what they really say, not what the media says they say, which is going through a filter, of course, and filtering out scientists, like Ian Clark at Ottawa U, for example. We want to hear what they really say. So what Danielle Smith should do, and I've said this on Rebel News a few times, and I've said this, to the people in the party, Look, I'm not a climate scientist. It's a super complex field. I don't know who's right, but I do know that there are a lot of different opinions among experts. So we're going to have open public hearings and we're going to well publicize them, make sure everybody can see them for free on the internet. And we're going to bring in scientists who support the climate scare, who don't support the climate scare, and many, of course, who are in the middle. And we'll just let the public hear what they have to say. And, the result of that, Rod, would be that the public would be very confused. They would not know who to believe. They'd say, geez, I have Professor so-and-so from University of Toronto saying we have to stop climate change with CO2 reduction. And then I have Professor Clark from Ottawa U saying, no, you don't, because there's no crisis. So the public would not know who to believe. And that's appropriate, because how would the average person be able to determine, are the scientists in this report right? And there's thousands of them, or are the scientists in the IPCC right? Well, they wouldn't know. And so what would happen is the public would then say, okay, well, if it's that uncertain and there's so many experts who disagree, why don't we wait for a while and just not do anything and see how the science evolves? And that would be a rational approach, of course. So, but they won't do it because they're so scared of being called deniers. This is, Daniel Smith and Pierre Poilievre and Scott Moe, all these people who are opposing the carbon tax. But you could say, well, no, I'm not a climate denier. That's ridiculous. I deny that I deny climate change. I'm a denial denier. That's what I always say. But the science is complicated, and we should listen to a variety of opinions. Suppressing one side, as the media do and as our politicians do, that's just not democratic. And, the election isn't tomorrow. So, I mean, they could build this up gradually. And I think it would be a big success. And I think then it would release Pierre Poilievre from the supposed obligation of having alternative methods of reducing climate change. He'd say, well, no, it's all over the map. We don't know what's happening. So we have to use the money to get ready, which is adaptation. And that's the key. Okay. You have to harden infrastructure. You have to build storm shelters. You have to build dikes and things like that. You have to actually try to prepare for climate change so that whatever happens, we'll be ready. And, one of the ways to be ready is to have a good, solid energy infrastructure. But we're doing the opposite. We're turning off our reliable coal stations. We're building wind farms and all this sort of thing. Oh, I got an alert on my phone here. I'll just say, okay, there we go. It stopped. So we're doing the opposite. We're making our infrastructure fragile because we're bringing in wind and solar power, which only work under certain environmental conditions and don't produce a lot of power anyways. So we're doing the opposite of adaptation. We're maladapting, or whatever the word is. We're making ourselves more fragile, more vulnerable to whatever climate change happens. Yeah. So the approach is totally backwards.
Yeah. In your report, you actually say when it comes to adaptation and preparing for climate change, I mean, you hear a lot of people talking about that who are involved in the scare, and what are we going to do? Water level is going to rise. Your report says that we actually, if we need to do any preparation for climate change, we should be thinking about global cooling, because there are some indications that that may be, and of course that was spoken of back in the 80s, and then they switched over to global warming. But your data seems to indicate that if there's a likely change, and you also say that due to extremes of cold or heat, our experience is that 20 times as many people die from cold extremes as from heat extremes. When that's
yeah, that was a study in The Lancet, which is a leading medical journal out of the UK. And, they looked at millions of deaths across dozens of countries, and they found 20 times more people died from the cold than from the heat. So for a high latitude country like Canada, that is a real concern, because you get it only a couple of degrees colder and you'll lose one of your wheat crops on the prairies. You know, if it gets a little warmer, well, so what? We'll just adopt farming practices as they use them in Arkansas. So, I mean, there's lots of examples of people farming warmer than we are now. So that's not a threat to Canada, but nobody's farming north of us. I mean, you know, we are a northern country or a high latitude country. And yet, you know, I look at Ottawa's climate plan, and in the section where they deal with adaptation, they only talk about planning for warming. I mean,
Yeah.
it's ludicrous. And you know, it's interesting because the warming, or I should say, the cooling is a very distinct possibility. Scientists who study the sun, Valentina Zarkova out of the, I think it's Northumbrian University in the UK. I wrote about her recently. She looks at the solar records, okay, what's happening to the sun, and other people like the Habibilo Abdusemitov out of the Pulkovo Observatory in Russia, which is near St. Petersburg. They look at these cycles in the sun, and you know, there's lots of cycles. You got the 11-year sunspot cycle, which is only about 0.1% change in solar radiation. It's not a lot, but you got other cycles which last for, in some cases, centuries. But what happens is every once in a while, all those cycles hit rock bottom at the same time. And that's forecast to happen by looking at previous cycles and, you know, superimposing and projecting to the future. That's forecast to happen by around 2060. In fact, Abdusamatov says that we're already starting to head down towards that. So over the next few decades, we're going to see a gradual cooling. So you have to look back, you have to look back in history and say, well, what happened last time we had what they call a grand solar minimum, when all the cycles hit rock bottom at the same time? Well, that was back, you know, during the Little Ice Age, and that was very cold. I mean, it was so cold, the Thames River in London froze a meter thick, and of course, it never freezes now. They had frost fairs on the Thames River. It was very, very cold, and they had famine and disease and wars. I mean, when it's cold, there's less resources, so of course, you have more people fighting for whatever's left. So the real concern, Rod, is not a bit of warming for Canada. The real concern is if people like Abdusamatov are right, that we better prepare for cooling, because, oh my goodness, you know, it would be much worse for Canada. And so we want to keep our solid, dependable energy sources like natural gas and coal. And but we're doing the opposite. We're making our system more and more fragile, which, you know, is ludicrous, because, I mean, if you have a choice, are you going to plan? It's never going to stay the same. There's always climate change. It's going to get warmer or it's going to get colder, little bits or a lot, who knows. But you should be hardening your infrastructure, burying cables underground. That's one way to avoid, you know, power loss during storms. And it is interesting because, as a great example for adaptation, when Hurricane Sandy hit New York City, there was a part of Manhattan that never lost its electricity or its internet connection or cable or anything, because all their cables were buried underground. So there are things we can do. And that's what Pierre Poilievre should be pushing, is saying, yeah, sure, of course, climate change can be a threat. So yeah, let's prepare. Let's make our society robust. Let's make our infrastructure robust and our energy supply. But the idea that we can stop it, it's a fairy tale.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of our time here. You've been very generous with your time, but I was glad to hear you mention a couple of times coal, because I believe, and I'm not a scientist, I don't know anything about you know, the proper use of coal, but I believe that we have the ability as the human race to develop technology that would allow us to burn coal cleanly, without producing the kind of you know, what would you call it?
Well, pollution, yeah.
The pollution, the particulate pollution that we have had historically from coal back in the days when, you know, London turned black, you know, from use of coal. But it's a resource that we have that is, you know, a tremendous resource. And we've basically in Canada, we've said, no, we're not going to use that resource. And we're shooting ourselves in the foot, I think. So sometime in the future, I'd like to speak with you about that and other energy sources that we do have. And look forward to some depth of from your experience and knowledge on those things.
Yeah, for sure. Coal actually is something we have centuries of supply. And with modern technology, we can burn it actually very cleanly. There's no question about it. Coal also has the advantage that you pile up, a long supply on site. You're not reliant on pipelines coming in always working. So coal is a very secure energy source. It's like nuclear, where you store the fuel on site, and it's also very cheap. That's why China is building coal stations like crazy all over the world. Of course, Canada is going to lead the world, and so we're going to close all our coal stations. It's totally nuts. I mean, coal is a wonderful energy source if you use the right technology.
Yeah. Maybe one day we'll be looking for a lump of coal in our stocking and think it's a good thing, not a bad thing. So,
yeah, exactly. In fact, it's interesting, Rod, one quick point. The trees of England were saved by coal. They had almost denuded the whole island of trees because they needed it for building ships and other things. When coal came along, it saved their forests. So that's something people don't realize.
well, very good. Mr. Tom Harris, thank you for spending time with us here early in January of 2024. And folks, you can learn more read the reports that they've put out at ICSC-Canada.com. That's great. Thanks, Mr. Tom Harris. Thanks for joining us today. You have a wonderful 2024 and lots of energy for you as you try to blow away some of the smoke and mirrors regarding carbon dioxide.
Yeah, it's for sure. And good luck to you. I'm about to read your yearly message on the Christian Heritage Party site.
Okay, well, wonderful. Thank you very much. Have a great day and a great year, Tom.
Thank you.